Hi, welcome to Cape Chronicle. I'm Jacob McCleland. On today's show, we have one guest, Diane Rehm, host of the public radio program, The Diane Rehm Show. A conversation with Diane Rehm that's coming up on Cape Chronicle. Stay tuned.
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today.
He fought against cruelty and injustice, but his greatest fight was against mental illness. Even icons struggle. Only the great ones keep going.
It's Cape Chronicle. I'm Jacob McCleland. Our guest today is Diane Rehm. Every day, 2.6 million people turn into her program on more than 250 public radio stations, including KRCU here in Cape Girardeau. Her guests have ranged from presidents to authors to scientists to leading experts in their field. She's hosted her own show, which was originally called Kaleidoscope and later changed to the Diane Rehm Show since 1979. Diane Rehm, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
My delight. Thank you.
And before we begin, I want to point out that we do have a live studio audience today on our program.
Good.
We have students from the mass media department here at Southeast Missouri State University and the communication disorders program here at Southeast.
Good.
Now, first, I want to talk with you a little bit about your beginnings in broadcast media, because this wasn't something you jumped into immediately. In fact, I think we're 37 years old when you got your first broadcast job.
37 years old, and I walked in as a volunteer. I had been a homemaker for 14 years, raising two wonderful children, and then began to realize that I needed to think about the rest of my life. I think women of that era were mostly homemakers. I had never been to college, so I really didn't know what I wanted to do. Of course, I had listened to radio from the time I was a little girl all the way through, and by total chance, a friend of mine mentioned to me that she had been volunteering for this tiny little radio station at American University, WAMU, which then had fewer than 5 full-time people. And as you know, 5 full-time people is the threshold at which a station can become part of NPR. So it wasn't even at the time part of NPR. But I walked in, I introduced myself to the host of what was then called the Home Show. We had a lovely conversation. She said, come back next week and you can help us put the program together. So I came back the following week, and with fear and trembling, because, you know, I had not been in the workplace for a long time, but I was welcomed at the door by the manager of the station, and she said, oh, you must be the new volunteer. Well, she said, I have some bad news, and my heart sank. I thought she was going to tell me to go back home and never show my face again. Instead, she said to me, the host is out sick. Well, I didn't know what that was going to mean, but she followed that by saying, so I would like you to come into the studio with me as she hosts the program. So the very first day as a volunteer, I was on the air helping her with a discussion with someone from the Dairy Council. And of course, as a mother I had thought about what the best foods were for my children. I felt that the Department of Agriculture had the pyramid all wrong. So I expressed my opinions. I asked questions. I, just did what I normally do. And I think I've been on the air every day since then.
So you just did what you normally did anyway, but this time you had people listening to you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, at the time when WAMU was so small, the listenership was so small because the tower was a small one. But as time went on, of course, it expanded. WAMU now has about 130 full-time employees, so it's grown a great deal.
I want to go back a little bit. You mentioned that you were a homemaker before you started in radio. In your book, Finding My Voice, you mentioned one of the questions in Washington that you hated to hear was, "What do you do?" That there was this stigma for women that stayed at home to raise their children. How do you feel that that's changed any for women today, that question and that stigma?
I still hear women complain that when they are at cocktail parties or they are at dinner parties, that if they say, "I'm a homemaker, I stay home, I care for my children," that people tend to ignore them. I make a point of saying, number one, congratulations, I'm glad you're doing that. For me, that time at home was so incredibly useful. I learned to cook, I learned to sew, I learned to play the piano. I think I had a life of privilege back then because the economy was so different. On a very small salary that my husband made working at the Department of State, we were able to buy our first home. He was able to support me and the children. Now it's so different. I think the pressures on young couples are so very different because it's almost assumed that women will be wage earners as well. But I heard the other day that it's trending the other way again, that more and more women are staying at home. Now, there's a problem.
Or men as well.
Or men as well. Now, there is a problem for women in professions like the law, for example, because promotions tend to take place in terms of how long someone's been with the law firm. But I think the workplace has begun to adjust and has begun to acknowledge reality, namely that women have children, they take off time to have babies. That should not impede their progress in the workplace. One of our own producers on the Diane Rehm Show is due to have a child in August. She's already determined that she'll be off from August until January when she wants to come back. And we are making arrangements so that that can be possible. And I think more and more the workplace is making accommodations.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you started on a local show and then on a very, very small radio station.
Right.
Fast forward, 40 years, and
Yeah.
now 250 public radio stations, 2.6 million people listen to your show every day. You've interviewed presidents, scientists, you've interviewed so many different people. I'm not going to ask you the dreaded who's your favorite interview question.
Thank you.
I am going to ask, though,
Okay.
because this is a problem we have at KRCU during our fund drives, because we have this fertile ecosystem of inside jokes that crack us up. Has there ever been somebody that was either so funny or said something so outlandish that you could barely maintain your composure on air?
Here's what happened, and I won't mention any names. After the Nixon tapes came out, I had a panel of former Nixon scholars, not former, but Nixon scholars, and people who were close to Richard Nixon. Indeed, one was counsel to Richard Nixon. And at one point in the conversation, one of the gentlemen stood up while we were on the air and said, "Diane, if you don't let me speak more, I am never coming back here again." And I said, without blinking an eye, "Don't worry, you won't be invited." I mean, what can you do with outrageous behavior like that? I think you just have to face it head on. I haven't had many experiences like that. You know, people ask me how I deal with unruly callers or callers who may go on and on. What they're not quite aware of is that I have, and I don't know whether it exists here at your station, I have something called a fader button. Mm-hmm. So we operate, number one, with a 7-second delay, and that's for FCC rules, that's for making sure that inappropriate words, ideas don't get on the air. But if a person is going on and on and on and on, and you feel you've heard the appropriate question once, I wait for that half an instant when that person pauses to take a breath, and I put the fader button down. So you, as a listener, do not think he's being cut off. I'm just stopping him. He's gone on long enough, or she's gone on long enough. So that's how we sort of make sure that the program does not get out of hand.
Is that when you'll say, "Thank you very much for your call"?
Absolutely.
And move on.
Absolutely. And move on.
Let's I mean, your preparation for your show is second to none. You bring it, every day you just seem so well prepared for each one of these topics, and the topics can range so much every day. Tell us a little bit about your preparation method, and is it different to prepare, for instance, for a congressman, for instance, as compared to an actor or an author?
The authors, I want to say up front, the writers probably interest me more than anyone. The reason being that they allow themselves to dream on the air. They're not wedded to any particular line or any particular idea that they're trying to get across. They allow me to probe in ways that, members of Congress, especially now, tend to have a line that they do not cross. You can ask a question in 20 different ways, you'll get the same answer. My preparation is totally dependent on a number of things. First, reading 3 newspapers each morning, and by reading, I don't mean to mislead you. I go through newspapers very quickly. New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. I go through those at home while I'm having breakfast. Then I get to the office. A script has been prepared for me by one of my superb producers. There are 5 full-time, 2 part-time. One person has taken responsibility for each hour. So that producer will put the script on my desk. The script contains the billboard, which you hear at the top of the hour. It contains the introduction with all of the individuals who are going to be on the program, some of whom will be in the studio, some of whom will be on ISDN, and some of whom will be on Skype. I was the first in the network to begin using Skype, and now there are a number of others who do it. It works very well on radio. I happen to like seeing people's body language. I like to look in their eyes. I like to know when they want to say something, and you can judge that better if somebody is on Skype. In the studio, you know when somebody wants it. If that person is just on the telephone, I have to listen very carefully for an intake of breath, which tells me that that person on the phone wants to say something. Whereas if they're on Skype, I can see they're raising their hand. They want to get in there.
They're chomping at the bit.
Absolutely. Going back to preparation, the producer has given me questions and answers which completely outline the topic. So I have started reading that at about 8:45 in the morning. Now, that is in preparation for the 10 o'clock hour. So I'm reading from about 8:45 until 9:15. I'm a quick study. I can take it in. And of course, I've read the newspapers. I'm listening to Morning Edition. I know what's happening in the world. Every now and then, after the first repeat of Morning Edition, I tune into Morning Joe so that I get some different perspectives on what's happening. And usually the topic that we're going to discuss that morning is being discussed all around. So all of that preparation may be for naught when you go into the studio, because what you have to learn to do, and I think we as talk show hosts really are misnamed. We ought to be called listening show hosts, because it's through listening to what the guest has to say and following that conversation that really is the essence of what makes a good program. And I tell people who aspire to do the kind of work that what I do and what you must do as a talk show host is first learn to listen. So that's pretty much my preparation. And then as soon as I get off the air, I am reading for the next day's second hour, which has already been done by the one of the producers. But you see, we choose our first hour topics only 24 hours ahead. Mm-hmm. So people are scrambling.
Yeah, yeah. I mentioned earlier we have a few classes watching us today as we're talking.
Good.
What are some of the things that for young folks that are interested in getting into broadcast media or into media in any way? What are some suggestions that you have that you have for them before they launch into a career like that?
What I tell young people who are even considering going into broadcasting is first to get the best liberal arts education possible, and then from there to choose a special area that they're really excited about, because broadcasters are, the big networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, and Fox, tend to hire people with special knowledge about something. I realize that many of the networks are looking for handsome or pretty faces, but at the same time, you have to come in with some real understanding, be it the weather, be it medicine, be it science, be it politics. So that's why I think getting that very broad education first and then narrowing your perspective and then taking that knowledge to a broadcaster is probably a better way. There are an awful lot of graduates of journalism schools, including this very fine graduate school of journalism here. The field is crowded. The field is so crowded that people with broadcast journalism degrees are having to look elsewhere. So I do believe that finding that specialty, being behind the camera, for example, learning to do the engineering part of it, those can all be good entrees into broadcasting.
I want to go back a little bit to something you said at the beginning of when we started talking today. You mentioned when you were home with your kids before you started your radio career, that gave you an opportunity to learn how to play piano and learn how to sew. And sewing, as I understand, is something that was very important to you.
Very.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think it goes back to my mother. I watched my mother sew. My mother was such an incredible seamstress that one day I recall my sister, who was 5 years older than I, had been inducted into the high school cheerleading squad. My sister came home and said she needed a skirt for the cheerleading squad, and we couldn't afford to buy her the fairly expensive skirt. So my mother said to Georgette, my sister, bring one of the skirts home. And she did. And my mother looked at that pleated skirt, created a pattern, and made my sister the skirt. She had that extraordinary talent. Now, my talent did not go anywhere near that far, but there is both an art and a science to sewing. And my husband once joked that he watched me put in and take out a sleeve 5 times until I finally got it right. And I think that persistence carries through in what you and I do. In other words, you're aiming for a certain standard. It may not be perfect, but you're aiming for that standard, and you keep trying until you get it to your own satisfaction. So I think sewing taught me a great deal.
Is sewing also, is it a certain connection that you still have with your mother?
It is. I think even when I'm hemming a dress or making a repair, sewing a button, I think of her making a beautiful coat for me when I was 9 years old. There is a photograph of me in that coat somewhere, and I'll always remember it.
I want to talk a little bit about spasmodic dysphonia. That's the condition that you have that affects your voice. Tell us, give us some background on what that is and how you learned that you have that condition.
In, I think, 1992, I started having symptoms of a tremor in my voice, and I had been taking a lot of Advil for headaches, to sleep at night. I had I think I was getting more and more anxious. And so I started going to otolaryngologists, and one after another kept putting tubes down my throat. And they all came away saying, there's nothing wrong with your voice, it's all in your head. That went on for 6 years until...
Did you ever tell them, I used to host a show about the connection between the mind and the body?
Of course, of course.
Huh. And it was they all just kept saying
They all said the same thing. And finally, in 1998, my voice was so bad, I could barely get a word out. So I told my boss I had to get off the air for a while because I had to find out what was wrong with my voice. I was off the air for 4 months, and finally my internist called my husband and said, we have to get Diane to Johns Hopkins. We have to find out if there is a cancer of the throat, that somebody is missing, that there is ALS or Parkinson's or something else. Within 1 hour, they diagnosed spasmodic dysphonia. It begins in the basal ganglia of the brain, sending an incorrect message to the vocal cords, telling them to clamp down inappropriately. And then you cannot get those words out. There is no known cause. There is no known cure. The only temporary solution is an injection of Botox into the vocal cords, which I have every 6 months or so.
We've been talking today with Diane Rehm, the host of the public radio program, The Diane Rehm Show. Diane, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking with you today.
Great to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today for Cape Chronicle. The program is a collaboration between the Department of Mass Media at Southeast Missouri State University, the City of Cape Girardeau, and KRCU, the public radio station for Southeast Missouri. I'm Jacob McCleland. Thanks for watching.